Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Lisa Bellear, or at least the few poems that are included here in the Literature of Australia anthology. Bellear was an Aboriginal author. She was a Gunapul woman. I apologize if I'm pronouncing these things wrong. I did try to look up the pronunciations, but I don't know how trustworthy what I found was. So she was a Gunapul woman of the Nunukul people who come from Queensland, Australia, what's now Queensland, Australia. She was a very political poet, an advocate of women's rights, Aboriginal rights, dignity for people living in urban spaces, etc., etc. And a lot of her poetry seems to revolve around these themes of human dignity, resistance to hierarchical power structures, racism, sexism, colonialism, capitalism, etc. And does so in ways that are often very directly confrontational with not only the power structures within Australian society or a sort of wider conceptualization of Western society, but also confronts those who should be allies, but often aren't effective allies. And this is the thing we all experience, right? Where our particular worldview, our particular concerns, the limitations of how we see things around us, how we see ourselves in the world and the world in general, often limit the liberatory possibilities we can imagine and the problems that we can conceptualize being faced by others. So Bellear's poems are often fairly lengthy. That's not a critique. I'm just sort of letting you know prior to reading the first one, which is the longest of the poems included in this collection. It's called Women's Liberation. It is a fairly lengthy poem, but it does a lot of interesting critical work, particularly in its sort of critique of middle-class white feminism, which in Australia, as in countries like the US, my country, unfortunately, middle-class white feminism has often ignored the concerns of women of color, trans women, lesbians, same-sex oriented women, whatever it is, women with disabilities, working class women, etc., etc. And so Bellear takes this critique and makes it the centerpiece of this poem from 1996. And I say, I give you the date specifically because in the 1990s, there was a sort of widening consciousness, particularly with the emergence of third wave feminism in the late 80s into the 90s, that the focus of second wave feminism, which was primarily about breaking the glass ceiling, getting women into positions of socio-cultural and economic and political power, had not served large groups of women who simply were excluded from that project and for whom that project did not speak to their day-to-day primary concerns. So this is women's liberation. Talk to me about the feminist movement, the Gubba middle-class heterosexual revolution way back in the 70s when men wore tweed jackets with leather elbows and the women, well, I don't remember, or maybe I just don't care or can't relate. Now, what were those white women on about? What type of neurosis was fashionable back then? So maybe I was only a school kid, and kids, like women, have got one thing that joins their schemata, like we're not worth listening to. And who wants to liberate women and children? What will happen in an egalitarian society? if the women and the kids start becoming complacent in that they don't believe they should have rights and economic independence? And what would these middle-class kids and white women do with liberation, with freedom, with choices of, do I stay with my man? Do I fall in love with with other white middle-class women? And it wouldn't matter if my new woman had kids or maybe even kids and dogs. Yes, I'm for the women's movement. I want to be free and wear Dunlap tennis shoes. And Indigenous women, well, surely the liberation of white women includes all women regardless. It doesn't. Well, that's not for me to deal with. I mean, how could I, a middle-class white woman who's deciding how I can budget when my man won't pay the school fees and the Diners Club card simply won't extend credit? I don't even know if I'm capable of understanding. Aborigines in Victoria? Aboriginal women here. I've never seen one. And if I did, what would I say? Damned if I'm going to feel guilty for wanting something better for me, for women in general, not just white, middle-class Volvo-driving, part-time women's studies students. Maybe I didn't think, maybe I thought women in general meant Aboriginal women, the Koori women in Victoria. Should I apologize? Should I feel guilty? Maybe the solution is to sponsor a child through World Vision. Yes, that's probably best. I feel like I could cope with that. Look, I'd like to do something for our Aborigines, but I haven't met one. And if I did, I would say all this business about land rights, maybe I'm a bit scared. What's it mean? That someday I'll wake up and there will be this flag, what is it, red, black, and that yellow circle staked out in front, and then what? Okay, I'm sorry, I feel guilt. Is that what I should be shouting from the top of the Rialto building? The women's movement saved me. Maybe the 90s will be different. I'm not sure what I mean, but I know that although it's not just a women's liberation that will free us, it's a beginning. So this is, of course, a complicated, interesting poem. There is, of course, the very direct critique, satire almost, of, again, middle-class white feminism focused on the particular issues that most impact middle-class white women, to the exclusion of issues that affect people who do not look like them, do not come from the same places they come from, etc., etc. But it's not just critique, and that's, I think, the cool part about it, right? Is that this isn't just a poem that says middle-class white women only think about themselves and therefore they're bad. It's also this last couple of lines here. I'm not sure what I mean, but I know that although it's not just a women's liberation that will free us, it's a beginning. That idea of hope and finding the possibility of your own liberation in the liberation struggles of others, I think, is actually a really important one. And it is very much worth noting that that's a lot harder to do from an historically dispossessed, oppressed position. For, say, Aboriginal Australian women to find their concerns mirrored in or doors being opened for possible liberation by the white middle-class feminist movement, it's not necessarily that it's hard to see from an Aboriginal perspective how that might open possibilities of liberation. The problem is really that it's not clear that middle-class white feminists are going to see in their struggle the mirror of Aboriginal people's struggles, right? So the issue is more a question of, do the people engaged in the struggle see possibilities for the expansion of their struggle to include other people's struggles? And I think Bellear is ambivalent about that, strongly ambivalent. So I think it's a difficult poem to pin down if you want to try and simplify its political position, because I think she has this great complexity of political thought here that even as the white middle-class women's feminist movement largely leaves Aboriginal women behind, it nonetheless is a liberatory movement. And to the extent that it opens up social possibilities for liberation, there's some element of a wedge issue here, right? The idea of a wedge is the wedge creates the gap, and then into that gap come other possibilities for liberation is sort of the idea here. And I think it's a very interesting, nuanced position, and I really, really like that. Another one I want to read you, actually the last one I want to read you in this video, is called Taxi for Joan Kerner. And this one deals really with urban poverty and racism, which is, of course, very, very prevalent, common issues in Indigenous experiences across the world, in the US and Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, Indigenous peoples who have been forcibly disconnected from their lands, move to cities and struggle to find economic opportunities because of discrimination. They struggle with social mistrust from the white establishment, et cetera, et cetera. So this is Taxi for Joan Kerner. Splashed by a passing cab and another, there's rules, you see. Don't stop for black women. Accelerate past black men and pensioners on pension day. Can't trust, trash, got no cash. We're all nuisances, reminders of an unjust world where the poor people of color are at the mercy of even taxi drivers. And so, again, this is a really interesting, layered and nuanced poem. There is, of course, the most, I think, sort of direct element of this, which is the critique of racism within a settler colonial society like Australia. The idea that the Indigenous people of this land are inherently poor, are inherently untrustworthy, are criminals, etc., etc. These, of course, have deep-seated roots in settler colonial ideology. And again, this is true across settler societies. And yet this last line, once again, we have this really interesting sort of complication. People of color are at the mercy of even taxi drivers. And I think it's that word even in the last line that's so fascinating to me. Because what it suggests is this complex awareness of the psychological principle that even those who are downtrodden can feel superior in a society built on racism, right? Even the poorest white person in a racist society can still feel superior to a person of color. And so in this way, racism serves an important psychological function in cohering whiteness and self-esteem to social structures of inequality. And that's especially important, again, in a context of capitalism. I mean, pensioners on pension day, can't trust, trash, got no cash. This focus on poverty, right? Because as Karl Marx quite astutely pointed out, we as workers have much more in common with one another across racial lines, national lines, ethnic lines, religious lines, etc., than we do with the wealthy of our own identity demographics. We have fundamentally more in common. That taxi driver who works for a living and struggles in a capitalist system has much more in common with the person that they refuse to pick up than they do with the wealthy white people who run their society. And I think Bellear is very aware of that and presents it not only very effectively, but in a really nuanced, striking way.